So, hello everybody. In today's class, we're going to take a look at the ending of the international relations section, take a look at the media section, and also begin the science section as well. And that's to ensure we are able to get everything in before the end of the semester. So, 3 different topics today, but just ending one, shortly beginning another one, but the bulk of the class will be devoted to the section on the media and the digital revolution. This is where we left off last time with the momentum of the war swinging towards the Soviet Union. What I mentioned previously, this is where America and Britain basically re-enter the conflict. And there you can see the process of liberation across Europe, with the Soviet Union establishing communist regimes in the east, and America and Britain establishing democratic regimes in the west. So they were both basically carving out their spheres of influence here. Not all the communist states were puppet states of the Soviet Union per se. Yugoslavia, for instance, would ultimately chart its own course, and Romania as well to an extent. But this definitely became the model of a newly divided Europe, split between the Western and Eastern blocs. And the two sides, America and Britain on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other, met in the middle in Berlin. That was basically the end of the war, and Berlin was famously divided itself. And so this became the structure of the Cold War. Britain fades a little bit out of the picture after this. The Cold War was basically fought as or not fought per se, it was a protracted struggle between the USSR and the United States. We'll take now a brief look at the aftermath. You see Britain and Europe and Britain and the Commonwealth, the long-term effect of the war as far as Britain might have been concerned. Well, the Eurosceptic strain, I guess you could say, became heavily a part of British culture thereafter. There you see a kind of joking account of the various Eurosceptic strains that might exist in other European states. When Brexit actually happened in 2016, when the vote was passed for Britain to withdraw from the European Union, it was presented as this shocking thing that was really unexpected. But it wasn't really actually a big shock. It was a part of a long trajectory which had stretched across decades, which was basically Britain's long-standing antipathy or suspicion of the European Union. And part of that is just a kind of ingrained xenophobia in Britain itself, a kind of suspicion of the continent and a desire to maintain that separation. But a big part of it is also just the legacy of the war. A major reason for the formation of the European Union in the first place was precisely to prevent another war, to allow for a level of cooperation and integration which would allow the European states to be less competitive with one another. And that's certainly the case with the two main players in the European Union up to this day, France and Germany. The countries are culturally and economically integrated to the point where it would seem ridiculous for them to fight a war today. They would just be hurting each other if they did that, whereas they were basically sworn enemies in the early part of the 20th century. So this cooperative model is kind of a big part of the European Union, although it's become an increasingly kind of economic venture in recent years. But Britain has always been suspicious of that idea. It does not believe that the European Union, collectively speaking, is the reason for preventing wars in Europe. No, they would take more the stance that it's liberal democracies that prevent wars from happening, and they want to maintain that kind of independent nationalistic identity, the idea that their liberal democracy stood up to the fascist regimes in Europe and also the communist regimes as well. So that kind of separation is a long-standing thing, and Brexit was the kind of culmination of something that had been building for a very long time. Also, Britain and the Commonwealth, here's another interesting aftermath. There you see the former nations of the British Empire with their various years of independence. There are still various British territories scattered around the world, like the Falkland Islands down here near Argentina, which I mentioned previously. They're not part of the empire per se anymore. They're just perceived as being too small to be independent nation states. But the irony of Winston Churchill's address to the British nation, the idea that if the British Empire were to last for another 1,000 years, well, it did not last for another 1,000 years. It basically lasted for 0 years after the war. The wave of independence and sovereignty swept across the world, beginning with India and Pakistan. That's the division after the independence movement there, and then comes to various other places as well. Nonetheless, there is the legacy of the empire that still exists to this day with the Commonwealth of Nations. This is a kind of loose-knit conglomerate of different countries that were once part of the empire, not an official union, so they're not actually legally or politically or economically integrated with one another. It's just a kind of loose-knit federation, we might say, and indeed the monarch, King Charles today, is the head of the Commonwealth, emphasizing that it's just a ceremonial kind of construct in a lot of ways. Now, the Commonwealth of Nations is certainly not a continuation of the empire. The empire itself is dead. This is just an ongoing relationship. But I would wager that one of the main reasons that the Commonwealth exists today is precisely because of the Second World War. The Second World War played a role of a kind of a last hurrah for the British Empire, an opportunity to try and prove that the empire was on some level a moralistic or ethical project, a kind of liberal democratic project that stood up to the fascist regimes. Now, of course, that's a little bit false because all along it basically was an economic enterprise, but it was an opportunity to present at least that front. And I would wager that if it had not been for Britain's response in the Second World War, if they'd not fought against the fascists and Nazi Germany, the Commonwealth probably would not exist. And you wouldn't see all of these Union Jacks in the flags of various countries. You wouldn't have the British monarch as the head of state in many of these countries. Australia and Canada, for instance, technically the King Charles, is the head of state in those countries. Something that's a little bit lost on the citizens there, but this grows out of the kind of morality, so to speak, of the Second World War. Purely ceremonial thing, the Commonwealth most closely associated with the Commonwealth Games, a kind of Olympic-style competition between the member nation states. So there's the paradox. British Empire dies, crumbles to nothing after the Second World War, and yet nonetheless it gets in its kind of last sort of glossy finish, or its last kind of affirmation on a global stage before basically disappearing. So now we're going to move on to the media and the 2000s, so taking us more into the contemporary context. And there's the itinerary we're going to talk about today. This will be a little bit shorter to ensure we can get to at least some of the science material today. I'm going to discuss the digital revolution in the context of global revolutions, the digital revolution and information, and the impact of the digital revolution on media. So the digital revolution will be the starting point for introducing another subject which pertains to these historical global revolutions that I've mentioned previously. Just to refresh us, there are 4 big revolutions. I'm sure we can come up with others. This is not supposed to be a definitive list, but just a working model, but 4 big revolutions in human history which have transcended borders or differences between people and have proven to be quite encompassing. You have the cognitive revolution, mentioned before. That's the biggest thing that ever happened to us, the biggest thing that ever happened to humanity, kind of lifted us out of the animal kingdom 30 to 70,000 years ago. Agricultural revolution, which I've mentioned before as well. Industrial revolution, which we've spoken about at length. And the digital revolution, which we're living through today, the most recent one. And I'm putting this up there because I would wager the digital revolution will be as big as the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution in terms of its transformative impact and encompassing change, an encompassing transition, which will turn us into a different kind of species. We won't be the same kinds of beings that we are today by the time we get to the end of the digital revolution. And part of what is fascinating about it, of course, is that it's quite new. We're living through it today, so we don't really know the directions it's going to take us in. Speak about these global revolutions. What do they really do? How do they actually unfold? And what are their kind of endpoints, if they have endpoints? Well, this is a kind of another story that is worth pausing over, because we might have the impression that once we start one of these major transitions, it just keeps building on itself and changing us continuously. Now, that might appear to be the impression we have for short periods, but something that we should keep in mind is the way that these kinds of revolutionary transformations can, in fact, plateau when they reach a certain point. That at certain stages, we no longer are experiencing the same level of accelerated change. And we can see this if we take the case studies of the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. There you see the percentages of land used for agriculture in countries around the world as of 2014, and on the whole, low percentages tend to reflect geographical factors, and the point of this basically is that the numbers are quite high. A large part of land on a global scale is being used for agriculture, growing crops, and raising livestock, essentially. And where you see lower numbers, places like Canada and Russia are not conducive to growing stuff. That's the reason why the numbers are low. Well, you look at this map and you get an idea that agriculture is following some of the same basic principles that it has followed for thousands of years. Yes, of course, there's new technology, new modern irrigation techniques, and we've kind of advanced to factory farming in some places. Of course, that can be its own destructive thing. But the basic principle, the basic idea remains the same. Clear out wildlands and replace them with crops that are useful to us, and also replace wildlands with grazing lands for animals that are useful to us. And that's why you see these vast monocultures everywhere. You have corn, you have soy, you have coffee, whatever it might be. Rows and rows of the same thing over and over again. It's not a natural thing, but rather our configuration that we put on the natural world. So too with raising livestock. All this animals, and it's a lot of the same animals like cows and chickens and goats and whatever it might be. And so we haven't really improved significantly on that model. We just keep doing it over and over again. And that's in part because this revolutionary transition kind of plateaued in a way, and we just stuck to the same model for a very long time. I would say you see something a little bit similar with the Industrial Revolution as well. We have the kind of impression that as soon as we start inventing something, some kind of technology, don't we just keep improving on it continuously over time, making it better and different? Well, that might be our assumption, but again, you have the plateauing effect that can occur, and I think aviation, air travel, gives a kind of nice insight into this, because how many times do we see a futuristic depiction of the world, and it's almost air travel that is kind of indicative of this future realm where people are zipping around in spaceships. Everyone has their own private flying machine or whatever it might be. That's really that kind of science fiction picture of the future, which gives the impression that when it comes to traveling through the air, we're just going to continue to develop better and better technology over time. Well, if you look at the reality, that hasn't really been the case. There you have a British Airways Boeing 707, which was introduced into commercial passenger service in the early 1960s. And what might strike you is it looks kind of like an airplane does today. Yes, of course, we've changed certain things about safety regulations, computers and airplanes, in-flight entertainment systems, whatever you might call them. We've tinkered and tweaked the model, but the basic experience of flying in an airplane has not changed significantly over time. In fact, the attempts to make these changes have been somewhat unsuccessful. There you have the supersonic jet, which was introduced in the mid-1970s, and this was supposed to be the future of air travel. Still kind of looks like a passenger jet, but it is at least different in the sense that it could go much faster. Except the British Airways Concorde, also run by Air France, never actually took off, excuse the pun, took off as a kind of major commercial enterprise. It was too expensive to run it, rising fuel costs. Also, the sonic boom that it creates ensures that you could really only fly it over the ocean. And so they were basically running their routes, New York City to London, and it became a luxury good. That wasn't the idea of the Concorde originally. It was supposed to be something that would replace air travel as we understand it. Everyone was supposed to be flying on the Concorde, but instead it became this niche thing, losing money for many years and then retired in 2003. I suspect that some company will bring back supersonic flight in some form, but again, probably as a luxury service, not as something that will be kind of universally used. So again, you have this kind of plateauing effect, and here's a joke from the show The Simpsons. Two characters are sitting aboard an airplane, and the scene is set in the future, and one of the characters says, "I love these new airplanes," and the other character says, "Yes, it's a good thing they reevaluated those wacky old designs." Now, since the scene is set in the future, we assume that when they show us the airplane, it's going to be this sleek space-age design, but actually, when they pull back, you see instead an antiquated design, something that looks like the Wright brothers. And the joke, of course, is it's the future. You're expecting it to look a lot better, but in fact, it looks older, rickety, creaky. There's a kind of truth in that joke. We shouldn't just always assume our technology just keeps getting better and better over time, when in fact, in some instances, it just kind of levels off. So there's something to think about with the digital revolution. It's not necessarily an infinite process of development and change. You can see plateauing effects that start to occur with the kind of technology we have, where on a practical scale, there isn't really any way for us to improve upon it. And so we just start using the same devices over and over, whereas other things are still in motion. So the digital revolution and information. This revolution may have started in the 1970s, so some people place the beginning as early as the 1950s. I say the 70s because that was really when personal computers were starting to become a thing. They did have computers prior to then, but they were these big, colossal machines. Individuals could not afford to own computers at that time. They were often associated with military institutions and stuff like that. Personal computers came into regular service and sales, especially in the 1980s. But I mentioned this previously. When I was young, when I was a child, not many people owned a computer. It was a kind of idiosyncratic thing to own, at least really up into the late 80s and early 90s. But I would say the real revolutionary potential of the transition only emerged with the internet, which came into regular use in the early 1990s. That's why I'm dating the digital revolution to the 1990s, because that was the huge transformation, the emergence of cyberspace, of this alternative parallel reality, this other world that exists in a kind of ethereal form, connected to our world, yet not existing in a kind of tangible, concrete space, but existing, as I say, in cyberspace. The impact of the digital revolution, well, we've discussed the potential impact on labor with robot cars, increasing automation in production and service. Everything to do with artificial intelligence is linked to digitization, to the digital revolution, and this should be sweeping and encompassing in terms of the kinds of labor, kinds of jobs that people will have as robots and artificial intelligence flood the industry. But what about the impact on human behavior, relationships, and thinking? This is something I mentioned about the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't just labor, but everything in terms of the number of people on the planet and where people live, what they do on a day-to-day basis. Something I mentioned previously, our very relationship to time. Think about that, something as universal as time. Everyone is aware of time, but industrialization changed, reshaped our relationship to time. So what might digitization do? Something to certainly think about. So I say the impact on human behavior, relationships, thinking, and reshaping human cognition. For now, I would say our predictions are limited to evaluations of current trends and developments, which include some things we can point to. COVID seemed to function as an accelerant in the sense that it drove a trend towards digitization, with more people working from home and online meetings becoming more the norm. COVID kind of forced people into this space of basically conducting meetings or family gatherings or events online through Zoom or Teams or whatever it might have been. And we also have virtual reality sets as well, like Oculus, which have entered kind of mass production. But I would say this remains an uneven process. We haven't completely migrated into the metaverse, as Mark Zuckerberg calls it. None of these products haven't necessarily completely swept people up yet. They're just hints and inklings of this kind of transition. What it speaks to, of course, is the growth of the online world, this kind of expansion as it becomes more detailed, more full of different things. Let's not forget about the introduction of robotics and technology just into people's day-to-day life. Artificial intelligence, as it continues to grow, becomes more sophisticated, more advanced. To what degree can robotics change just basic things like human relationships and interactions? Life-size AI robots that can offer deep and evolving relationships with people. Put that up there almost for comic relief. The AI companion who cares, right? It is one of the things of artificial intelligence that it cannot actually care about you on a deep level because it is, after all, an artificial construct. But perhaps we can sort of trick people into thinking that these AI units really do care about them on a personal level. There you have this kind of creepy image of this girl with pink hair who actually looks a little bit bored, right? I'm not sure if they're going for the realistic touch there. But imagine that you can construct a robot that looks very human-like to you, a kind of avatar which just on a superficial appearance really makes you think that it's a person, really makes you think that you're talking and interacting with a person that responds to you with such a depth and complexity that it brings you into that world of a personal relationship. And this might have significant repercussions for individuals in terms of relationships they form with others, individuals who are perhaps tired of lurching around from one bad relationship to another. They would rather just spend time with their dream bot, right? This model companion that they've designed themselves, personally constructed their ideal companion to look the way they want, to speak the way they want, to act the way they want them to. Obviously, still in the future, those are trends and currents we're thinking about right now. We should take a step back, though, to really kind of ask ourselves, what is this thing? We've talked previously about kind of getting down to the heart or the essence of the other revolutionary movements, just when discussing industry, for instance. Well, the digital revolution, what is it when we get down to it? What is it actually involving here? Well, I like these kinds of connections across history. Mentioned that the Industrial Revolution, we can boil it down to some essential things and say, well, this is a new way to manipulate fire. It's a new way to use water. These just basic things, part of human sustenance for thousands upon thousands of years. I think the digital revolution is similar in a respect that is something very simple and essential in terms of what it entails. And here we can perhaps link it to something in our deep past, the cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution may have represented a major change in the amount, complexity, and detail of information that humans can process, transmit, communicate, etc. Something I mentioned previously. Well, the digital revolution may also involve the ways we process and transmit information. It has greatly compressed the storage space of information while also radically accelerating the speed with which information can be sent, received, and accessed. So they're both on their own levels about information. Information, well, this is one of those kinds of open-ended terms and concepts. You think about information, you think about it in relation to data or facts, but rest assured, we're always processing information, right? It's just about taking things in your environment, organizing it, structuring it. There's a stream of information continuously at all times. But we also store information in places. We record things, take things down. And ever since the time of recorded history, that's been one of our main endeavors and enterprises enterprises. Information, when it's recorded, typically takes up space. That has been the story basically across the history of humanity. Time was, if you wanted to have a vast reservoir of information, you would be best served by going to a library because it would be full of books. And those are all conduits of information, all containing their own data and facts. Well, the digital revolution has radically compressed the storage space of information. Now you can store a whole lot of information on very small devices. Take this as an example. Let's say 500 pages of text equals 1 megabyte. You have a phone with 64 gigabytes of storage, could therefore hold 32 million pages of text. The average length of a book is 320 pages. I don't know if it is, but let's just say for the sake of argument, 32 million pages would equal 100,000 books, enough to fill a large library. In other words, this device is capable of storing that. I mean, that's the kind of compression down to these small dimensions. And not only that, but as soon as you have your phone or just access to a computer, you can have a stream or a flow of information coming through. It's always stored in a space, but now it's stored on much smaller levels. And thus it has greatly increased the access to information and also the immediacy of it as well. You can access information as long as you're online, as long as you have access to the internet, which is not a universal thing in the world, but as long as you have access to the internet, well, think of all the different amounts of information, stories, images, narratives that you can access quickly and easily. It certainly was not always the case. Some estimates suggest that if you could print out the entire internet, I don't know why you'd want to, but if you could, you would end up with something like 300 billion pages. Now, again, assuming the average length of a book is about 320 pages, printing out and then binding the entire internet would leave you with about 938 million books. Estimates indicate that the total number of books published in modern history is in the range of 130 million. In other words, there is way more information contained on the internet today than was produced, published in the entire history of humanity. So since the 1990s, the amount of information that we have at our disposal has exploded relative to what existed previously. It is far in excess of the amount that was printed previously. And it's just all sorts of information too, right? It's not necessarily to say that it's all good. No, it's just a stream of data, a stream of stuff that's being held, stored in these repositories online. You can see the impact on different industries, different things, and this will take us more in the direction of discussing the media. You see a description of the rise and fall of the compact disc. Remember the compact disc, CDs? Well, no, right, increasingly. But they were a thing. When you go back to the 90s and 2000, this was the kind of wave of the future of using CDs to store music or DVDs for films. But they've gone into decline steadily over time to the point where they're kind of novelty items today, almost collector's items, because you can just find everything online, Netflix, YouTube, whatever it might be. You don't need to purchase the tangible product. That's the thing. You don't need to have the kind of object that you hold in your hand. You can access things like films or music or even books just online, and they exist in this kind of ethereal state, an immaterial state. Time was you needed to have the physical product to access this stuff. Not necessarily the case anymore. So too with computer games. For instance, time was they'd sell computer games in big boxes with manuals and maps and the discs inside. Okay, you don't need to package computer games in that way. Just download them online and there you have the product. It's a reduction of the kind of a substantial concrete thing for holding information as it becomes more fluid and intangible. And something I mentioned before as well, money too has become like that. It's kind of divorced itself from the tangible and migrated into this online space. Nobody is truly in control of this process. We might have the sense that there are these kind of massive monopolistic corporations that try to control the digital revolution. Well, yes, they attempt to do that. Think of those giant companies like Meta and Apple and Microsoft, for instance, but they're not actually in control of these things. Rather, this is a giant wave that kind of sweeps us forward, and we're just being carried along and basically flailing about. And you can see this when you look into the past, because we have these massive monopolistic evil corporations which were unable to survive digitization. There you see Blockbuster. There's another name that's becoming increasingly antiquated today. But make no mistake, Blockbuster in the early 2000s was a giant monopolistic company with over 9,000 locations worldwide, because that was the store where you went to rent movies, or to buy movies, as the case might be. And they almost might have seemed kind of impermeable, like this dominant company at the time. By 2010, bust, destroyed by Netflix and videos on demand. You don't need to go into a store to rent or buy videos anymore. Blockbuster actually could have purchased Netflix. That was a possibility for them, which obviously they should have done, because then the company would have survived. Kodak as well in the early 2000s. There's another kind of increasing name from the past. In the early 2000s, Kodak dominated much of the Western market in film and photography. That was because it was a place where you would go in to develop your film. You're taking photographs, you'd have to go into the place to get the tangible product, photographs that you actually hold in your hand. But in 2012, filed for bankruptcy due to its inability to adjust to the increasing digitization of images and film. Don't need to have a hard copy of photographs or pictures anymore. You can have them if you want them, but I would wager for the vast majority of you, all on your phone, just stored there, or on the cloud, as the case might be, right? Almost this kind of intangible space instead of a stack of stuff that you're holding in your hand. I'll take a kind of a British case study here to see how this is working, and also to understand the effects that this is having, because it's not just the case that we're storing information in a different way, but it's also having an impact on the circulation of information and how we process information. Encyclopedia Britannica, first published in the UK in 1768, is a world-famous series of books on general knowledge. We say encyclopedic knowledge, basically meaning knowledge that is general and basically covers all the bases without necessarily giving you a critical perspective. And here was another very long-standing institution going back to the 18th century, but the books are no longer printed. The last print edition came out in 2010. You see a cartoon satirizing a door-to-door salesperson hawking encyclopedias. Long-standing joke was that encyclopedias were always a terrible thing for a person to have to sell, because they're big and they're bulky and they're expensive, right? And nobody really wants to buy encyclopedias, but they kind of figure that they should, because if you kind of live in a household that values learning and knowledge, that's a very respectable thing to have encyclopedias. So there you see someone kind of trying to push this idea of actually purchasing these objects which would give you access to, yes, information. You need to have the physical product in your house in order to have this access. Encyclopedia Britannica killed off by Wikipedia. That's the reason why they're not printed anymore, because Wikipedia, founded in 2001, has approximately 53 million articles written in various languages, including about 6.3 million in English. That is way more than Encyclopedia Britannica ever had at the height of its production. And rest assured, Wikipedia has an absolute monopoly today on encyclopedic knowledge. It's generally common knowledge that if you want to learn quickly about any one of a given number of subjects and topics, you can plug it into Wikipedia and find quick information that way. As I said, encyclopedic knowledge is not really giving you a critical perspective. It's just trying to teach you as much in as shortest time as possible by giving you a kind of broad overview. Here is a kind of a model of the modern monopoly, because the thing is, Wikipedia, as I say, it has this kind of monopolistic draconian control over encyclopedic knowledge, but it's a non-profit company. That's the kind of contradiction woven within it. I would wager that all of these kinds of digital companies could be non-profit underneath it all. Of course, the ones who actually run them generally don't want that, but they certainly could be. Official employees of the company number a minuscule 350 or so. So that's the number of people who officially work for Wikipedia, which is tiny given the size of it. But you do have a lot of people who work for Wikipedia, but they are just users of it. These are the people who work in this kind of freelance capacity, going online, editing these pages, doing research on their own, and basically writing them. You yourself might edit Wikipedia pages. You can if you have an account. There are almost 47 million people who have a Wikipedia username today, which is a vast number of people. And I think the important point here is that these people work freely and voluntarily. Nobody's actually paying them to do this. So it's a kind of freelance voluntary labor. And you think of the kind of effect that it has in terms of producing information. Well, you don't necessarily need a vast apparatus of quality control when you have millions of people looking at the pages. That's where the quality control comes in. You just need a lot of people seeing the same things, and it becomes this process of editing and revision. Of course, that's precisely the kind of thing that makes a company like Wikipedia a kind of threat in a way. And that's precisely why you see various authority figures trying to curb as much as possible existing discourses, especially when it comes to contemporary news. Because Wikipedia deals with contemporary events, lists contemporary events, and tells you what's going on in the immediate moment. And you can see, you can appreciate the kind of frenzied struggle that happens on Wikipedia pages as everyone is trying to shape and curb the dialogue in the present moment. And I wager that you can speak about government officials, authority figures, corporate life, whoever you want to mention, all those individuals who fear the unfettered flow of information. Same thing today as existed hundreds of years ago during the Renaissance. Those in power, the wealthy and the powerful, do not like the free circulation of information because it's dangerous from their perspective. Take a look at the impact of the digital revolution on media. We're just going to touch upon this briefly. Today, 95% of people in the UK say they follow the news, and that's certainly not a kind of surprising statistic. Most people follow the news in some capacity or another. But what has changed dramatically is the way they follow it, with social media now serving as the main conduit. Interesting point there. Social media, you think about companies like Meta or Twitter or X, I guess, as it's called right now. Those have become the main springboards or conduits to international news, which is a significant change. Speak about the filtering mechanism and also the immediacy of political and social issues. You see a chart showing the ongoing decline of newspaper circulation in the UK. There's something that has certainly been another kind of offshoot of digitization. The idea of the local newspaper that would be delivered in a physical copy, that too has become increasingly a kind of a thing of the past as all this information migrates online. You still have a lot of the old standing newspaper companies, but they exist increasingly in this online space. Their subscriptions are online subscriptions, and they're making money off of the advertising that exists online. So this idea of the newspaper that's delivered to someone's front door, not to say they don't exist, but they're not quite the prominent news sources they once were. See a list of prominent news sites and their links to social media. And Facebook is the #1 social traffic source for news websites and various kind of major newspapers on the left-hand side. These are certainly the kind of major players that you see when you plug any kind of topic or issue into a Google search engine. Note that you don't necessarily get a really diverse set of different sources. It's just a lot of the same sources over and over again. So speaking of monopolies, I would say that these kinds of familiar names like Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, Fox News, etc., ABC News, they have kind of grown in stature in terms of the official conduits of information in society, and they are basically linked to a lot of the different social media companies today. I'm going to speak a little bit about Facebook, or Meta as it's now called, and the role that it's playing in the circulation of information today. Well, let's take the break right now. We'll come back in 10 minutes and talk about that.